My name is Olave Bassabosa, and it is both an honor and a pleasure to be welcoming you all tonight to the second lecture of our 2022-23 Studium Generale Gent lecture series. Now, before we get on with tonight's inspiring lecturer and her lecture, first, a quick introduction of the Studium Generale Gent. Our theme for this year, and I'm going to make a short but actually quite long proposal and suggestion for the tone and the mood for our gathering tonight. Okay, first things first. The Studium Generale Gent, which we abbreviate as Studium Gent, is a whole Gent, a whole Gent course and public program that invites its audience, you, to discussions, debates, and critical reflections on society, art, culture, and science. We do so by curating and hosting 10 lectures each year that are centered around a specific theme. Well, through consultations with my inspired colleagues at KASK and Conservatorium, our external partners and good friends of the Studium Gent, I am happy we chose the following theme: future ecologies. Let me quote Malcolm Ferdinand. This is my very bad translation in English of his French, amazing French. He says, "The dualistic opposition that separates nature and culture, environment and society, establishing a vertical scale of values that places man above nature." This is his definition of the so-called Great Divide. And he explains that this Great Divide is revealed through the technical, scientific, and economic modernizations of mastering nature, whose effects are measured in the extent of the pollution of the earth, the loss of biodiversity, the disruption of the climate, and in the measure of gender inequalities, social misery, and disposable lives that are engendered. Now, this is from Une Ecologie décoloniale, and inspired by people like Malcolm Ferdinand, who so articulate a beautiful call for decolonization, and really call for the rejection of the separation from man and nature, we at Studium Gent seek to explore this year future-orientated ways of thinking, propositions and imaginings which presuppose the inextricable, sorry, I can't speak English anymore, I wrote this myself, huh? I can't pronounce it. Which presuppose the inextricable intertwining of humans with their environment and their non-human neighbors. Humans as part and not master and lord of ecological systems, which we define as dynamic life communities of living organisms and their physical environment, which includes both biotic and abiotic factors. To that end, at Studium Generale, we invited thinkers, doers, makers, and researchers to share with our audience their learned and creative visions of the future of the ecological systems that house, enable, threaten, and or change our societies. Now, our guest speaker tonight is Kes Otter Lieffe. Kes Otter Lieffe is a working-class, chronically ill, femme trans woman. She's an author, facilitator, and community organizer that is currently based near Berlin. She will tell us a little bit more about that. She's the author of the Queer Animals and Plants series. This is one of the examples, no? Queer Animals and Plants series, zines, yeah, very cool. Go back. And several short stories and Margins. Sorry, I gotta go back. This is Margins. This is a trilogy, Dignity, Control, and Conserve. Very cool stuff. They're not up for sale tonight. I wish we could, but they are very easily found. Like you can buy them online, right? On your website. The Margins is a trilogy of queer and trans speculative fiction novels And in these futuristic stories, marginalized characters, both human and non-human, take center stage in powerful resistance movements. So, before we invite her to come and share with us, I want to say a few words about the tone we strive for at all our Studium lectures. We are cognizant that the topics we will be addressing this year can and will elicit intense thoughts and feelings. We believe that a collective commitment to the intention of care can help us shape this tone and the nature and perhaps also the beauty of our gathering this evening. We understand the intention of care to be multidimensional. So, the first dimension, we ask you to carry with us the intention to be caring towards our speaker, towards each other, and towards ourselves. How can we be caring towards a speaker? At the Studium, we think it's important to always keep in mind that they are, above all things, that they are guests whom we have invited to speak and share the ideas, their research, and their ambitions for a better future. We ask you to help us extend the warmest hospitality to our guests and the kind of hospitality that allows them to be vulnerable with us, vulnerable in their feelings and in their thinking, vulnerable enough to make mistakes, vulnerable enough to have the courage not to have all the answers, or use the best terms or words, or have chosen what they're willing to talk about and what not. We need you to help us create those conditions for them. As for the intention of taking care of each other, we think of it as being full of care in how you address each other and also how you hear each other. We think it's helpful to keep in mind that the Studium lectures are above all things pedagogical in nature, and it is sound pedagogical practice to respect each other's dignity, believe in each other's earnestness, and nurture each other's curiosity, and feed each other's desire to learn. We need to do that all together. Last but not least, we encourage you all to practice care for yourselves. Pedagogical spaces require of us to practice self-care in the form of introspection, especially when we find ourselves feeling uncomfortable or sometimes even in pain. I want to encourage you all to not only sit with the discomfort, but to study it with an open curiosity. What worldview and or view of yourselves feels endangered in this space? How did you come to acquire this or that belief? And what or who is placed at risk by this or that perspective? In summary, we ask you to be full of care for our guests, for one another, and for yourselves. And now it's time for what we all came here for. In tonight's Studium event, which is part presentation, part storytelling, Kes Otter will explore some of the interweaving strands of queer ecology and what they could bring to our social movements. She asks us how learning from non-human nature could help marginalized communities become stronger, and how solidarity and mutual aid might help to decenter the stories of a powerful few. She invites us all to take a full breath and dream deeper for the sake of our future and survival. Please welcome Kes Otter Lieffe with a warm applause. Have fun. Have fun. Okay. She's very nervous, so, let's be nice.
Be nice. Yeah, I am really nervous, and this is something I don't do. So I am literally going to invite you to take a breath because that's what I need to do. So I'm going to take 3 nice deep breaths and stand like this. Yeah, if you feel like taking some deep breaths with me, please do. Thanks. Yeah, thank you everyone who helped organize this evening. Thank you also, Anya, for these gorgeous little fish and the illustrations that were in the video. Apparently 1,000 people saw the video, or 1,000 clicks, which is wild for me. Anya also illustrated the Queer Animal and Plant series. So yay, Anya. And they really hate me right now. Yeah, thank you, Natalie, who's also there. Yay, Natalie. And Mo for housing and feeding me last night, even though my train arrived 3 hours late. That was wild. Thank you for picking me up. And I want to take a moment also to think about some of the invisible work that it takes to create an event like this. So, for example, somebody at some point built all of this. Someone cleaned the bathrooms. Someone drove that very, very late train through the night that brought me here. And someone grew the food that we just ate. That was amazing. And I feel like all of this is work that's quite easy to forget sometimes. But it's also a reminder of how interconnected we actually are in real and practical ways. And finally, thank you to each one of you as well for coming out to hear some stories and hopefully share some stories. I think it's really easy to perceive a person on a stage as being this kind of completely separate individual who came up with some ideas all by herself and is maybe even an expert on some things. And I kind of don't think that that's really how it works. I feel like life is more complicated than that. I feel like we're interdependent, we're interconnected. And clearly, everything I know or think that I know has been co-created by countless humans and non-humans, countless conversations and written words, and lots of quiet moments sat with trees. And I feel like these kinds of connections become clearer to me as I look deeper into ecology and queer ecology specifically. I'm going to get more into that later, but first I want to start with a little story. And I push the button. It's part of a short story which I wrote, which was published in Our Entangled Future, an anthology on social change and the climate crisis. And in fact, it's a story that's set 50 kilometers away from where we are this evening, in a park in the north of Brussels. I read recently that the name Brussels comes from an old Dutch word meaning marsh, and another word for home, so literally home on the marsh. The flag for the Brussels region, as I'm sure you know, still has a yellow iris on it, which is a water plant, because it was all marshland. The city itself was founded on an island in the river. And actually that river still exists. The Seine, or Zena, runs right through the center of Brussels, and few people even really know about it. It's a river, but no one knows. And before I wrote about the river, I wanted to learn something about its history. This is what I found out. For hundreds of years, the Brussels Seine was poisoned by human and industrial waste to the point that nothing could live in it. There were outbreaks of cholera, and not surprisingly, the neighborhoods near the river were poor and working class. The river became associated with disease and poverty, and the ruling elite wanted to turn the whole area into Parisian-style boulevards. Brussels has actually been gentrifying for a really, really long time. The river that the city was built on was dead. And finally, they covered it over. And for the last 150 years, the Zena has been hidden under concrete. Plenty of people don't even know it's there, running forgotten under our feet every day. And not until the year 2000 did anyone even try to clean the water being dumped into it. So I wrote a love story for the forgotten river under Brussels. There are two characters in this love story. One is a perch, this cute little stripy fish, and one is a kingfisher. The waters were rising again. He could feel the change all around his scales, the tiny eddies and swirls, and the subtlest increase in pressure on his gills. For a sensitive perch, it felt like his whole world was changing. He had to push harder with his tail to keep up with the current. He'd already caught 3 other fish that morning, 2 roach and a tiny minnow. But if the canal burst its banks again, he'd have to work a lot harder to catch another. The pounding of rain on the surface had been getting more powerful all day, and his home was changing. He was strong, and he would adapt. His will to live, to survive, was everything. He was moving now, and he knew the canal was escaping, bloated with rainwater pouring over the concrete edge, through the broken wall, and out into the King's Park. For a while, the perch resisted the pull, his back braced until the pressure began to send shivers down his spine and his fins burned with the effort. He let himself be taken, and the current was incredible. Within seconds, he was flushed through a hole in the wall, barely avoiding a lethal line of barbed wire. A field of green passed below him. He was flying. He wanted to look down to take in this bizarre new experience, but he nearly collided with a tree. He swerved around the massive trunk and swam out into the park. He could taste other waters joining now, a goldfish pond absorbed into this expanding lake, an exploded water main that had irrigated the king's roses for a century. The perch could even taste the drowned bushes and herbs mixed in with the stagnant canal waters. Still pulled along by the current, he soared through the private gardens, swerving around statues and monuments, remnants of the long-forgotten dynasty of kings and some of the worst atrocities in African history. This park belonged to the animals now, the perch and the roach, and a flash of electric blue above him. A color so intense, he felt it pulse through his nervous system. Fear, defense, panic. He was already swimming down towards the grass below him, but the waters were too shallow. He wiggled down into a patch of nettles, bent over in the current, and he knew it wasn't enough. He looked for something better. Too late. A collision as a mouth closed in around him. A cold, hard beak that was already dragging him up and out of his element. Air, harsh and cold and all around him. His body going into shock. He felt it shutting down, pain killing endorphins flooding his little body. This was how it ended. She landed silently at her favorite willow branch. Still the perfect spot for fishing, despite the floods. She quickly finished her meal. Today was an easy hunting day, and she was full. She'd never hunted on this side of the wall before, because there'd barely been water or fish here. But with all that food trapped in a few shallow centimeters of water, nothing could be easier. Normally, she hunted by the river, and out of sheer curiosity, she took flight in that direction. Her belly almost hurt from the sheer amount of food inside it, but she flew fast and free in that direct way that kingfishers do, through the beech trees, over the bloated canal, and to her regular spot. She landed on a branch slick with rain and took in the scene. Here ran the last few meters of the Seine, the Zena. Normally it was an insipid little flow, a distant echo of the great river choked into a canal and buried beneath sidewalks. Today, the river was alive again, churning and crashing below her. The little kingfisher knew it would be impossible to hunt in these conditions, but her belly was already too full to care. Transfixed by the sound of raging waters, she felt her eyes growing heavy. And despite the pounding rain and the incredible changes to her world, she tightened her grasp on the branch and slept. So, interestingly, after I wrote this story of the Zena re-emerging from its concrete tomb, in real life, 2 years later, and 4 kilometers north of where I set the story, a small part of the river was actually released as part of an engineering project. I think it's just interesting how things work out like that sometimes. As the history of this river reminds us, things like ecology and politics and class and all the other factors are intricately tied to each other. Stories are complex, and especially when it comes to things like the environment, everything is deeply interconnected. It's so big. When I was a kid, even growing up without the internet, can you imagine? In small right-wing military villages, I was already really aware of the environmental crisis. I spent a lot of time outside, walking in fragmented pieces of woodland, away from people. I fell in love with the nettles and the orange-tipped butterflies and the crows on the oak trees. My heart broke as I watched the tiny river that I walked by every day being slowly killed by the military that my family worked for. I remember one day the water of the little river was covered in oil and rainbows and smelled like poison. So habitat destruction was something real and tangible to me. And some of my earliest memories are of this burning desire inside me to do something about it, to protect the little river and the orange-tipped butterflies. I didn't have access to a lot of information, but I often heard about conservation. I regularly visited parks and nature reserves with my friends. All of my friends were over 60 years old, by the way, and really, really into birds. And going to places like that gave me life and connection and hope. We were poor as fuck as a family, but anytime I could, I would send donations and I raised money for those conservation charities that put shiny advertisements through my letterbox. I really wanted to study conservation, to learn how to protect the butterflies. I was all in. It took a long time before I learned that conservation, like so many things, is more complicated than the story that I was being told. A few years ago, I was living in Bristol, in the UK. And one day, I went for a walk on the Clifton Suspension Bridge, this super famous bridge, and I saw this sign that was sponsored by the zoo, which taught me a lot about who gets to tell the stories of conservation. I'll summarize the story for you so you don't need to read it all. Oops. Oops. The site where the bridge was being built was at one point the home to a very rare plant called the autumn squirrel. Isambard Kingdom Brunel, the architect of the bridge, was warned that constructing this bridge would destroy the habitat of the autumn squirrel, so he had the plants relocated. Some bulbs were moved, the plants survived, and on that sign, they declared this as one of the first recorded examples of plant conservation, even though mostly he just destroyed a habitat by building a big bridge on it. Another aspect of this story that they don't mention on the sign is that at the same time as the bridge was being built in the 1830s, there was a struggle for democratic representation in the area. Out of a population of 104,000 in Bristol, only 6,000 had the vote. And in 1831, there were massive pro-democracy riots that broke out in the city and lasted 3 days. Now, for Brunel, this architect, this was all bad news. Investors in his bridge withdrew, and the riots threatened to disturb the bridge's construction. So he was sworn in as a special constable with the police. He took up arms, and he joined the state suppression of the uprising. All of which I find super interesting, right? Because according to that sign, sponsored by the zoo, Brunel was this amazing guy who basically invented conservation. So, not the indigenous people who protected and co-created their lands for tens of thousands of years or more. Not resistance movements worldwide resisting English colonialism. Some guy built a bridge on top of the habitat of a rare species. He took a little coffee break to grab a sword and go downtown to crush a pro-democracy demonstration. And somehow he became the world's first conservationist. So who tells the story and how makes a big difference. But as I said earlier, I used to be really into all this conservation stuff. And once upon a time, I went to university to study a degree in ecology and conservation. Or at least that's what they called it. There was a lot of learning about genetically engineering tomatoes. It seemed a bit weird. One of my teachers was really into fox hunting. Also a bit weird. But I think the most surprising part for me was that the conservation aspect of this degree didn't seem to really involve people that much. And there was almost no discussion about what was causing the problems that conservation was supposedly trying to resolve. Also, it was a science degree, right? So discussion in general wasn't particularly a thing. It was more like, this is how you save the forest. Just write this down and remember it for the exam. And we shouldn't forget that conservation is an industry. And this degree existed as a part of that industry. But I cared so much about the lizards, and the penguins, and the giraffes, and the butterflies. And I was taught that the multinational, corporate-funded organizations based in the rich countries were taking care of them, so it was all good. And actually, it didn't seem that complicated. Just find somewhere really beautiful with some sufficiently cute animals that people want to protect, build a huge fence around it, keep the people out. Or like some of them, right? So researchers are okay, Rich tourists, definitely okay. Maybe some hunters occasionally, but probably not the people who've lived on that land forever. Somehow, we imagine that this wilderness had formed all by itself, with no influence from humans at all. Maybe a few indigenous people could stay in the park, as long as they lived in traditional ways so that tourists could get a good photo. If they modernized, they were evicted. And it might take a conservation-funded paramilitary to keep them out. Or an arms deal to buy that paramilitary some Kalashnikovs. And then, those well-armed paramilitaries might commit human rights abuses against indigenous people, in the Congo Basin, for example. But it's all in the name of conservation, and conservation is always good. And in case this all feels like some dystopian future that I've created for one of my novels, these are real allegations made as recently as 2019 against a major conservation organization. My second novel, Conserve and Control, thank you. I was hoping you would do it. Is about fortress conservation, as it's known. It's also about greenwashing and the co-optation of queer movements. There's also a lot of class politics in there, and some sex work. It's complex and weird, and I love that. I'm here for it, really. I mean, I'm complex too, as we all are. I'm a writer, which is already strange for someone with my background. I've also been a grassroots activist for more than 20 years. I'm an ecologist, specializing in queer ecology, which is really niche. I'm working class, chronically ill, trans. Put all these things together, and I guess it makes sense that I'm writing stories about queer resistance, class uprisings, trans herbalism, industrial conservation, and little birds eating little fish in a park in Brussels. Because for me, all these things are intimately connected. My queerness is absolutely tied to my desire for freedom from oppression. Being trans and feeling kind of on the edge of human society sometimes is absolutely a part of why I love more than human nature with such fierceness, and why I spent so much time with that little poison river and the butterflies. That was a bunch of words for me and for you, so let's have a little breath again if you want to. And one more. After 20 years, lost in cities, this spring I entered a new, fabulous stage, and I returned to living in the countryside. I wrote a lot of this presentation in the middle of an epic storm, in a caravan, surrounded by the sounds of bees and ravens and mosquitoes and the rumbling of thunder. I live now in a tiny village in Germany, which is absolutely not where visibly queer and trans people are supposed to be living, by the way. But it was time for me to escape the city. People like me are often pulled to the city for our safety and connections and community. But for myself, personally, I don't always find safety there. I was living in Berlin for a few years, and just before the first COVID lockdown, there was another epidemic in the city, one of violence against trans people, almost all trans women. Women were being attacked in their homes, set on fire in public transport, beaten with metal rods in Berlin. Before lockdown even hit, I felt unsafe leaving the home. So cities can definitely be sanctuaries for some of us. But in that moment, I longed to walk among the trees and the rivers and the birds and get the fuck out. Then COVID happened, and I ended up in self-isolation for the best part of 2 years, in a one-room studio, surrounded by kilometers of city. It wasn't great. But, some pigeons moved in on my balcony. And I honestly think that they got me through it. Can you imagine anything cuter than these two pigeons? This is Blanca and Miss Electra. And they were such incredibly cute little babies, I couldn't even deal with it. Do you love them? Are you obsessed? Aren't they amazing? They were so cute and fluffy. I could tell you hours of stories about pigeons, but, you know, just enjoy. And they bring me such nice memories. I even didn't want to disturb them, so I built a little cardboard kind of lookout with a little door so I could watch them and not disturb them. It was so cute. I love them. So sometimes the city is difficult for me. But for a lot of my marginalized friends, conservative European countryside is the last place that they want to be. But also, if we're all in cities, importing everything we need from outside, how do we connect with land or with environmental struggle? If we don't have meaningful access to land, which almost no one does anymore, and we're all just barely surviving, why or how could we care about butterflies or climate change or extinction? I used to work in a supermarket for about €2.50 an hour. And if we didn't finish on time, they locked the door and we had to keep working through the night. I used to work in a care home for elderly people, pulling 70-hour weeks and 24-hour shifts. When you're that tired, who has time to think about the environment? There's a reason that what we often think of as the environmental movement in Europe is dominated by privileged people with comfortable jobs in the non-profit industrial complex, or those who have the free time to go on a nice demonstration from A to B. Not always, obviously, but often enough that it's kind of a thing. But even though it can feel like all these struggles are super isolated from each other, and that's probably really strategic for those in power, there are still connections to be made. And one story that brings things together and really pleases my little queer eco-anarchist heart is... I had so much fun with these slides. Vampire bats, Desmodus rotundus. Some of you expect to get, some of you probably will not. It's a super cooperative species that survives by helping each other. As we know, vampire bats feed on blood. They also have huge energy needs for keeping warm and for getting around. After just a couple of days without food, a vampire bat will die because they can no longer keep their body temperature stable. They need to eat a lot and regularly. They're basically living on the edge. They live in groups, sometimes all-female groups, snuggled up in the hole of a tree, sharing food. Researchers found that females shared food with their babies, which was expected, but also with other females. And some of those females have a special relationship, as they called it. And they share food together, specifically, a hungry female licks her friend's wings and lips, and then maybe gets to share a delicious snack of regurgitated blood. Without this food sharing, the annual mortality of vampire bats would be about 80%. Instead, it's 25%. So for vampire bats, sharing is definitely caring. And what's really interesting here is that these females and their special relationships aren't genetically related to each other. So it isn't what biologists call kin altruism, which usually involves an individual helping a close relative because they share genes. But vampire bats do form really long-lasting bonds up to 12 years, with mutual feeding and mutual grooming for parasites, all of which massively increases their chances of survival. And surviving is good for passing on your genes, which might also pass on this mutually supportive behavior. So sometimes natural selection favors solidarity. As is often the case, biologists have seen exactly what they wanted to see here. Maybe vampire bats were just not very smart, and they couldn't tell who they were related to or not. Or maybe the begging and donating behavior, and they literally call it that, was because it's easier to just give a donation so that hungry bat would leave you alone. As usual, all of this says more about the biologists than the bats themselves. And by the way, the males also form bonds. They hang belly to belly, and they lick each other, both with an erect penis. I feel like I need to write that gay vampire story at some point. So, what's my point here? Vampire bats form same-sex partnerships in all female communes. They live close to the edge of survival, and so they form bonds over many years and help each other get through the hard times. Obviously, I'm projecting a little bit with the story of mutual aid and lesbian bat communes, but I think we always are when we discuss other species. The point is that helping each other to survive, which we might call solidarity, mutual aid, cooperation, is a fundamental part of how life continues. Which kind of brings us to queer ecology. These little ducks are so cute. Here's an introduction from the queer ecology part of my website. Human, non-human. Natural, unnatural. Sentient, non-sentient. You, me. Our intellectual world is full of binaries that are disrupted the closer we look at them. There could be more bacteria living in a person's gut than they have human cells. And they're essential to our ability to digest food and to live. There are no humans without non-humans. Each one of us is a community. Individuality is a myth. In June this year, scientists discovered that a massive stretch of seagrass off the coast of Australia, big enough to cover 3 times the surface area of Manhattan, is actually one single asexual individual and the largest plant in the world. So what are individuals? 94% of giraffe sex is between males. 94%. A quarter of tropical reef fish species, like Nemo, change sex during their lifetime. There are whole species of lizards with no males at all. So what is sex? I find queerness in non-human nature to be a profoundly important subject. There's something about knowing that there are bisexual deer and gay ducks, and that each one of us is a community, connected to everyone else. That just gives me hope. As so many young nature lovers, I grew up with wildlife programs on TV. And I never once heard about any of these things. Complexity and diversity were reduced down to very simple stories of male bird meets female bird, does a little funky dance to impress her, they mate, they make little baby birds, and that's the whole point of life. As I began to research the few texts that exist on the subject, I discovered a world far richer than I could have imagined. I've now been writing and teaching about this subject for years, and I realize more each day that actually none of this is new. While the term queer ecology might be relatively new, among many indigenous communities living closer to the non-human world than the industrial society I grew up in, this knowledge of more than human gender, sex, and sexuality is ancient. Shall we have another breath? Oh, you're such a sweetheart, thank you. I didn't have a cute picture for this one, I'm sorry. So what about utopia and future ecologies? What about dreams and stories? In 2016, super tired and burned out and despairing about the state of the world, I started to write. I didn't know it then, but I was giving myself the gift of time to write my visions of change, present, future, real, almost real. It was a big decision, and a very self-indulgent one. But having a vision gave me something to work towards. And the opposite of that was also true. I was lost, but writing new worlds gave me the chance to create tiny flashes of what I wanted, even if they only existed in stories, for now. After a few decades of grassroots organizing, it was inevitable that the stories I started writing would be populated with some of those projects that I've witnessed in real life, or just in my dreams. Mutual aid projects, where instead of charity, people show up for each other in solidarity, working together to meet our needs. Squatted gardens that turn wasteland into food and biodiverse community space. Autonomous health centers and herbal apothecaries run by queer and trans people that center our needs and give us access to what we need without gatekeeping. Sex worker self-defense classes by us and for us. All these self-built programs that meet the material needs of the most marginalized, because sometimes we're the only ones that we can actually rely on. And for me, these projects feel something like divestment, moving resources and energy away from the structures of oppression and building something better. Because every time we resolve our conflicts without calling the cops, we're living a part of prison abolition. Every time we meet our own needs without industry or exploitation, we grow our new world. Every time we find ways to care for each other and the land and hold on to each other in a culture centered on disposability, we're creating social change. I'm also fascinated by this idea of edge and margin, where worlds collide and boundaries bleed, where the real action takes place. What if those living in the margins are sometimes the best adapted to change, including climate change, because we've always been finding ways to survive together, because we've never been comfortable for a day in our lives, because change is all we've ever known. And of course, sometimes living on the edge means that we're the first to die during a pandemic, the first to freeze in our homes during a gas crisis. Sometimes there's nothing romantic about it at all. As for my dreams right now, I want the land that I live on to have even more life this time next year. Even more dragonflies and red kites and little lizards that live under my caravan. And the frogs with golden eyes and golden stripes who live in the pond. And the little beetles who climb into my bed during a rainstorm. Amazing. Too many of them, but they're really, really cute. I want my communities and all our marginalised communities to be stronger this time next year. And I want us all to survive and live as our best selves. What if the water ran... What if... Wait, 2 seconds. What if the water ran cleaner every year? What if liberation was something tangible that we could touch and taste? I know it just seems like a fantasy, but for me it's important that we don't underestimate the power of dreaming. Imagination could be a critical element of change, inspiring us, keeping us oriented towards the future that we crave. It can and it should be a strategic part of making plans and building movements. If we don't perceive where we're going, then we lack direction and goals to work towards. And without goals and dreams, we're at risk of losing ourselves, and we can waste a lot of time and energy trying to find our way back. I consider myself really lucky. My stories are now very much out in the world. A few thousand books have been printed, some hundreds of copies sent to trans women and others in prison. I even get to be on a stage having conversations about vampire bats. All of this has been possible partly because I'm really stubborn and I don't give up. And partly because I have the capacity to work 7-day weeks over several years, which is what it took to get the books out. And not everyone has that capacity. Not everyone I know has that capacity, even if their stories are really fucking important. And with so many barriers that stop people publishing or otherwise telling stories, getting them out into the world, we end up with a monoculture of just a very few stories that get told over and over and over. And again, it feels like something complex being reduced to something that is too simple to be true or useful. I think there's a tragedy in that, and I think about it a lot. I also think that stories have power. Shared visions have power, and that power should be shared. We should all get to tell our stories. And it's one of the reasons I've held writing spaces for marginalized writers over the last few years. I'm still just starting to write myself, but sometimes all we need is some space to create without judgment or impossible capitalist standards. So what happens when a group of marginal people sit together to connect with the land and imagine 3 or 10 or 1,000 beautiful utopian things that might happen there? Will those visions inspire us to make plans? And what happens if we confront the rift between what we hope will happen and what we expect will happen? And what if we transform that pain into action? So if you want to, if it feels right, maybe find a little space like that for yourself sometime. Sit or lie down somewhere that you love and dream the best dream for that place that you can. Lean into your visions of hope and let them bring along their feelings and ideas, maybe even some plans. And then share your dreams and see what happens. So much is possible, and the world needs more stories. Thank you so much. A mandatory slide and fish. I'll take it.
Welcome, sit down. I'll get you some more water. Hold on. It's a long, 50 minutes is long, huh?
I have no idea how long I was talking. I think I passed out for a little while. I have no idea what's going on.
Take a break. Take a breather. Let me talk to this audience for a second. You're leaving? Okay. Hi, everyone. While we let her take a break and rest, I want to talk to you a little bit about this next portion of this evening, which is me and her having a conversation, and perhaps y'all contributing to that. I don't really like the Q&A structure. I don't really like it. I think it causes, for me anyways, a lot of stress. I sit and think about all the things I have felt and vibrated to and resonated with, and then I'm trying to share that, but then it has to be a question, and then I'm like, okay, how do I make this a question? And then, and it just, I end up basically either being saying nothing at all, or well, that rarely happens, but I always say something, but it ends up being a fake question. Well, in fact, I wanted to share something, I wanted to comment, or I wanted to, just contribute in some way or another. So I suggest we just do that, right? If you feel in what we're about to have a discussion, talk about, or in what you heard earlier, if you feel a need to share something, and it might be not fully coherent, it might not be a full question, it might just be like, I felt that. Let's allow space for that. Let's allow space for each other to do that. Is that what I want to say? Also, I think it's important. Kes talked to me earlier and said to me, one of the reasons why she does this kind of appearances, even though it makes her super stressed out and really scared, she does it because she also hopes to learn from the people in the room, right? So normally she would have wanted this to be a circle, and well, that's not possible here at Studium. I'm so sorry. So I want to encourage y'all, even though you may not think this is really important, or this is something brilliant, I think maybe we can give some of ourselves back to her so that it's also indeed an experience where she also feels like she's connecting and learning and right? That's what you...
Sounds great, thank you.
Yeah? Okay, so I'm going to ask you to be extra brave, extra courageous, and share tonight, okay? We have until about 9:30. I mean, not until about, until exactly max 9:30, because there are also people here who have to go home and who have to like clean up and they also want to get home on time. So at 9:30 we absolutely must stop. So you have till then the time to collect your courage and ask for Helena to come by and give you the microphone and for you to just vibe, you know? It doesn't have to be a question. It can be a comment, it can be an observation, it can be whatever.
Everything is good.
Okay, are you now rested?
Yes.
It wasn't so bad, right? It was. These people are very nice and
I had
friendly.
a really great time. I really
They send a lot of love into, no?
Definitely.
There is I am very anxious about this conversation myself because I got to know you through your books, actually. Chihiro Geuzenbroek, I don't know if you remember her. She told me about you, and she was like, you should read her books. And I love science. I'm like a hardcore science fiction fan, right? Like, I love sci-fi. And so I was like, oh my God, yeah, speculative fiction, awesome. And I think I read the first one in about a day and a half, which is it's a thick book, huh? It's a thick book. And the letters are not very small, but still, like, I went through it so quickly because almost every page, for someone who reads as much science fiction as I do, I felt like I was in complete new territory at every page, right? Then I ordered these other two at once. I was like, I need both of them. They took far too long to get to my house. Then I read all of them. And so I'm a little bit afraid that this conversation is going to be me fangirling.
I'm here for it, it's okay.
And then all of you will be like, what are
possible.
they talking about? I didn't read the books, okay? So how do I act like a professional? Okay, let me start with this. And I think you talk about this in your lecture just now about the margins. I have read so much science fiction. I have watched so much science fiction. I have listened to science fiction is my life. And yet, I don't remember ever reading a book that so deeply, a series of books, that so deeply is committed to people, characters, human and non-human, who exist at the margins. Like, I'm so used to these tropes of science fiction, of like, and fantasy as well, you know, the Neos of the Matrix, who are like, meant to be or like have been prophesized, or the people who are like amazingly great at some amazing talent and they go fight everybody. You know, I'm so used to these central characters who are like more than human, you know. But what you do is you stay at the margins. Sex workers, people with disabilities, people working in low-paying, hard, you know, in health industry, like badgers in the city. I think even at some point, I think I was reading this whole section which was about a plant. I mean, you're so committed to the margins, and I was a little bit unsettled and sort of like, you know, like I kept waiting for them to turn into somebody exceptional. I kept waiting for all these different characters, kept on till the very end, kind of waited for them to turn out to be some prophesized amazing individual who's going to change everything, you know? And you just stick to the margins. Why? I guess that's my question.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, they say, like, write what you know. So there was no way for me to write, like, somebody super, like, centered, privileged, something, it just wouldn't make sense. And it's kind of not the point of the writing project for me. A part of it is, like, writing people who are a bit like my friends or friends adjacent or something, just like a little bit like telling those stories that don't get told. And I remember in one of the writing classes, we're talking about like building characters. And I had heard like from a few people, they were like, okay, so your main character is this like older, sick, trans woman who really likes, I don't know, herbs and radical politics or something, so you wrote yourself into a book. And that was interesting for me because nobody would accuse, for example, Dan Brown, I don't know if we're allowed to say like real names, but like Dan Brown, very famous author, who writes, you know, this main character in all of his, like the Da Vinci Code, this person. And, you know, the main character is this like academic, cis-het, middle-class, able-bodied white guy in the US, written by someone who is also all of those things. And no one is like, oh my God, Dan Brown, you wrote this like unbelievably niche character who looks just like you, because that's actually just the centered experience. But like no one has that experience, actually. That's, I don't know how many percent, but like, not many people have those experiences. So it's interesting that we're so used to having certain kinds of characters be centered. And then anything else, they're like, oh, that's so weird, that's so niche. And then people who don't like vibe with those like tropey people in science fiction are like, oh my God, a sex worker in a book? But written by a sex worker, not a non-sex worker, for example. And like, I think I think a lot of us just find some kind of, like, not visibility, because it's a really difficult word for me, but I feel like there is some kind of, like, use the word vibe, which I really like. There was just kind of like, oh, finally, there's like a little bit of a breath of fresh air, and I think I'm just writing the books that I wanted to read, really. And yeah, there's a power in that, and I've seen that with people who I've shared like writing spaces with and stuff. I like on the receiving end, when I get to like consume somebody else's amazing work, there's something in that of just, there's a little bit of a breath of fresh air. There's a little bit of a relief. There's not waiting for Neo or some other completely unrelatable, incredibly specific experience. You're like, oh, thank goodness. So I don't know how well I do that, but I think that is part of it for me, and I think that's why, even though I have no idea what I'm doing and I'm just starting, I think just people are just so excited that like there are like characters who remind them of their mates or themselves, and I think there is something that we just need in that. We never get that.
Yeah. I think also as a writer myself, I was curious at how because these scenes of like these non-human characters that you know, like you showed us tonight, that you portray so well, that you embody so well. I was really kind of curious, like how do you do that? How do you come into these perspectives? Like, are you like do you like research the hell out of like this badger that you're about to put into, you know, as a little
badger?
vignette?
I can't remember the badger.
No, there were so many different animals that move like there was one that was flying and like caught something like, and like you have these little vignettes that kept on happening through the book. It's like I was so curious, like how do you see these different, you know, embodied creatures in the city that I don't know. I would normally, like now I walk around thinking there's a whole lot of stuff happening. There's a whole lot of stories going on around me that I have no clue about. How? What's your
I love that you call them stories. That's how I think of it. I think I think it did it particularly with Dignity, which I wrote in a city. And it was something I really wanted to play with, that there's this main story, which is some humans doing a thing with some other humans. And then instead of it just being the backdrop that they're walking past a fox or some mating hedgehogs or whatever, I can't even remember.
I think the hedgehogs are what I think are badgers.
Yeah, maybe it's the fucking hedgehogs making a lot of noise or something like that. I was like,
coincidentally, in the same park, I'm pretty sure there was some intense lesbian sex also in the. Okay, you should have read the books. I'm sorry, I can't help it that you didn't read it. But okay, yeah. So the badgers, the hedgehogs. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So I think it was like interesting for me in the way that people do it sometimes, and I think this is a thing in literature, but I don't really know anything, is like telling the same story from two different characters or something. I've seen it on a Netflix show, which doesn't count probably, but there was like, this thing happened, and then they show it from one person's perspective, and then the next episode is from another person's perspective. I can't remember what the show was. And I was like, what about that, but not only humans? Because there's all this drama going on, and there's a riot, and there's a thing, and there's all this drama, and I was like, but like, what do the foxes think about that, really?
Yeah.
Because that's happening like on their habitat. It's happening like right next to them. Do they care? Are they, do they notice? Because I also have that experience of, I'll be sitting somewhere beautiful and I meet some amazing little non-human animal. And I'm like, it's not that she just appeared because I noticed her and now she like is important. She's like, she just noticed me. She's living her life, she's doing her thing. And I'm just like, oh, human, all right. And has her own perspective, her own story, and it's not all just like, she didn't just like appear because I thought about her or I like paid attention. She was just like living her life and doing her thing, and I feel like there's like a perspective in there that we're just like part of this whole thing. And we will see that sometimes with humans, we're like, oh, this person noticed me, oh, I like vibe with this person in the street or something, but what about the pigeon who's watching you from the roof or something? And to answer your question, I think, how do I do it? It's a tricky one. It's almost the hardest part for me. It's the easiest to do, and the part that I'm most conflicted about, because who the fuck am I to be talking about a pigeon's perspective or a hedgehog's perspective? What the fuck do I know about it? And still I want to tell the stories because I really love them, and I just kind of want to. And I'm a little bit like, I hope I didn't get it wrong. They're not going to tell me, but I think it's one of those things where I'm like,
they might get on Twitter though.
Yeah, right.
And be like, you don't know the lives of hedgehogs.
For sure that's happening somewhere in the internet. I don't know about it. But yeah, I do think there's a part there that I'm like, I hope I get this right. And I'm doing it with like respect and knowledge that I can't possibly know. And just to like, visibilize those stories or something that would otherwise be.
Because what I also found interesting is that in those stories, like you talk through these perspectives, through these embodied non-human perspectives. You talk about things like home. You talk about passion, fear. I remember, I think it was even one little animal that was sort of nesting, like making her little nest really pretty and nice and comfortable. Like you talk about these things, and I wonder, whether you think that other non-human animals also kind of have these sort of notions and feelings and aspirations and desires.
Yeah, it's a really good thought. I think there's always a bunch of projection, right? That's all I have to work with. I have this body and this experience. I can't possibly know what a perch feels like. And if I'm longing for home, then maybe that's a little bit coming out in my fox building a little home or something. And I forgot your question. Oh my God, sorry.
Yeah, no, just about like, because I feel like you're very comfortable kind of sort of extending those human concepts to non-human animals.
Right.
And I don't know, like, should we not?
Right.
Like.
Yeah, of course, there's some of it is anthropomorphization, which I can't say, but it's a thing.
The thing, yeah.
No, that one. And I'm sometimes okay with that because everyone does that, and that's what we have to work with. And I think sometimes we don't do it enough. So I remember there's a cute story about sparrows, which I wrote for Anya because they love sparrows. And it's like a super common bird that lives in the city that like humans don't really notice very much. And they're often in these little groups, and they're often like nesting and making a lot of noise. And I know because I like learned about them and because I spent a lot of time watching them, they definitely have friends and enemies and people that they like to sleep next to. And they have relations. So if you're just like walking by, you're like, oh my God, those noisy birds. You're not really thinking like they have these experiences. But of course they have like another sparrow that they like more than the other sparrows. And that sparrow did something nice once, and that sparrow keeps sitting on my spot on the stick or something. I don't know exactly the details, but those things definitely happen. And it might be different to how we experience it. It might happen very quickly, and they're just like, fuck you, you're great, fuck you. It might be like although that can also be human experiences. But I think the fact that they're like having those interactions, that they have society, and that that's not only limited to humans, kind of changes the way we see things. And I think that's something really important when we're talking about queer ecology, because people will be like, humans have like queer community or something, and then animals don't, but oh no, they do, and then something and something, but it's still just like humans have society and community and things like solidarity, and everyone else doesn't, because it's all about humans. And I'm not sure that's true. I think that there's more going on, and people who watch them and like know see all those things happening all the time.
Do you think it's accessible to everyone, this sense of attunement to what's happening, these different perspectives? Is that something that is this observation, this watching, is it something that we can all practice, you think?
I wonder. For me, it's always just been there. As I say, like I felt very kind of pushed out by humans growing up, so it just wasn't it was kind of obvious that I would like have as much in common with an orange-tipped butterfly as the people bullying me at school. So I think that helped. But I think with like enough time or enough space, I don't see why it wouldn't be possible. I kind of feel like that used to be everything, and we just kind of lost that in industrial society and cities and things. So maybe, I definitely have like held spaces where people did it. There feels like a tragedy there for me of like, that so many, I mean, I definitely remember these experiences where I was like, really just like vibing with the plants or something, and no one else got it, and they were all just really into, I don't know, fashion or something. And I was like, I don't really get it. Like, how do you know all of these famous people, but you don't know the plants who like live in the schoolyard or something? Like, how is this a thing? And I feel like there's, you know, this like concept of species loneliness, that we just focused on this one species and we're missing the other 4 billion or whatever it is, numbers. But how we're not separate in that way. We're not even separate from each other. So how are we possibly separate from everything else? And there is something kind of mind-bending about these ideas of like queer ecology, that all of our cells also contain mitochondria. There used to be a bacteria that was living independently. We're made out of other organisms. We're like built out of them, and we survive with them, and we're eating plants. And we're like, how, like, we can't imagine that we're just like these little isolated, autonomous beings, that all of those things aren't important. And I think that switch, which is not a switch for a lot of people because they never believed anything else, right? I'm like definitely just talking from my own experience of growing up in industrial society where we don't have that connection. And I think for some people that switch is like, oh wait, well then I can't destroy all of these things. And like these stories are important. I can't just like walk through the world destroying them if they're like part of my family and they're like part of me. It's not possible to do that if we have those connections. So I think this idea of interconnectedness is kind of a powerful place to start from in terms of, deciding how we move forward.
I think that's interesting because there's this concept that I don't fully understand, this notion of climate despair. Have you heard of this? That there's more and more, and whenever I hear about it in the news, they talk about young people have climate despair. And I'm fascinated by this notion, and I wonder often whether it's not, when they say young people, whether they don't mean white young people who feel climate despair, and then like, and then I really wonder, is it about like, oh, we will not have the kind of lives that are promised to white young people, the kind of lives that our parents had because of, turns out capitalism isn't working out. Or is it a despair that comes from exactly this species loneliness? This, where it's not about like, okay, we will not be able to, keep on buying whatever Instagram tells us to buy because, at some point we're going to have to stop. But that it's about indeed this sense of a disrupted, like ties, connections that have been severed and cut off.
Right.
Maybe that's something which somebody maybe here wants to share on, because I really don't fully understand this notion of climate despair and climate depression.
Yeah, I don't really know much about it, but I do think that you were touching on this very important thing, which is this species loneliness as a part of just like collective trauma of being like removed from our home. And like, I think that disconnect, it's quite easy to ignore it. We can fill the hole with things that we buy from Instagram. Is that what it's called?
Is that what it's called? Did you just say that? Is that what it's called? A
It
shade.
was super cute. But I do think there's something in there that's very, very strong that we just kind of don't really access. And it's something that, I mean, you saw how emotional I got just talking about, like, what if the water was cleaner next year? Like, I can't, it's almost impossible for me to hold that, like, expectation that it won't be. And that gap that I was talking about between, like, what I hope and what I expect. And I want to turn that pain into action, but sometimes it's just pain. Sometimes it's just like, fuck. And I remember being with the Poison River when I was young and just crying a lot. And we watched some kind of like 80s environmental movie or something at school, not that old, and just crying because, I don't know, the whales were being killed or the seals were being eaten or some very like simplistic story. But that pain was so real to me, and I couldn't really understand why it wasn't for everyone else. Like, I don't know what their pain was, but they had other pains. But for me, that's just like such a fundamental source of pain that I think actually probably a lot of us are experiencing, and we just do something else with it. And I'm like, I don't want that to exist. I want to do something about it. But I think it's a very common thing. I think where this idea of like trauma as being like for one individual or something, and something like just like, individuals have trauma and they have like solutions or something. I think there's a lot of collective trauma. I think there's a lot of like non-human trauma. It's something that's, with all of us in a way.
Because I think what you also talk about conservation, so this notion of we need to go somewhere far away that is, oh, there's somebody holding a microphone? Oh, okay. Speak. Because I can keep going. I do not stop.
Interrupt us, please.
No, first I want to say thank you very much to both of you. I really feel like I wanted to hug you at some point. You resonated on so many levels. And to answer, if someone wants to intervene, I grew up in a village, and we were very connected to the nature. We saw different breeds of insects and animals that today my children don't have access to because I had to move to the city. But I do think that there is a serious disconnection between a certain generation, and it's not their fault at all. It's industry and capitalism. There's a serious disconnection and access to nature where we live. My children, they see dogs and cats, right, and maybe some rats and pigeons. But that's about it because we live in Brussels. I do know that in my culture, historically, in a big region, there were so many writings where animals were part of the story, characters that spoke and portrayed emotion, and it's based on a lot of observation. People could observe. My grandmother would sit on her patio whole afternoons with no TV, no phone, just watching her garden and the lands in front of her and telling us, I saw that cat the other day and it did this, and you know, the mice.
Or the cat gossip.
She would tell us all these stories about and the trees, and so I do think this despair comes from a serious disconnection that we can solve by going and taking those empty pieces of concreted lands in the cities and doing projects that involve nature and animals.
Yeah.
That was it. Thank you.
That was
Thank
something
you so
very
much for
powerful.
sharing.
I'm, you know, like I was sort of struck when I found out about sort of the history of the decline in biodiversity. I think a lot of us, when we hear about the biodiversity declining, we think jungles, you know, we think coral reefs far, far away. And I was struck by the discovery that I made in my own research that actually, like the biodiversity on this continent was the first to really start massively being destroyed, right? So, like on a massive scale. So whether it is this guy with his bridge, that may look like a success story of one plant that was conserved, but the Industrial Revolution in the Western Hemisphere, in Europe, decimated the European biodiversity. And it's so interesting, this notion of stop with the WWF, stop, which is the organization you would not name, but I'm very comfortable
Please
naming. WWF, evil corporation.
I didn't know what we could get away with.
I'm willing
I don't
to
want to
go
get
for
sued.
it. I'm willing, yes, they can call me and sue
But
me.
I think
it's
they
fine.
did sue someone, right, recently.
They can sue me as well. It's
Right.
fine.
It was like a
It's like-
defamation suit or something.
Also, I feel particularly angry about WWF because I was a donor for many, many years, and then
Same.
and then I started finding out about what they're doing in countries like where I come from, and the kind of paramilitary and the human rights abuses that they absolutely facilitate and contribute to. So I feel particularly angry, but indeed, the concrete here in our cities here in Europe. How about we try to bring more life there than this year, than we have today?
Right.
That's a very powerful challenge, perhaps dream to have. More life here. How would we go about that? I know very little about nature, but
Here, right here.
yeah, well,
We can put up
perhaps
some
here, I
nest
don't know.
boxes. We break up the concrete outside. We plant some plants. Yeah, I guess it's kind of like and I don't think I came up with it. I've definitely adopted it from someone. And I think it's kind of, as I was saying, it's a goal, right? And I think the details and the specifics kind of come once you have that goal. But what I realized, particularly when I'm connecting this idea of stories and dreams, was that in the social movements, a lot of the social movements I was have been involved in, there was still just very few stories, and it was this is what we're doing and this is what we're fighting for. And, some super, super privileged academic person was presenting those stories, and everyone kind of, people like me would be well, you seem smart, I don't know anything, internalized classism and all the things. You read some books and you know about Marx or something, then you must be right and I'll do the thing. And then realizing...
On March, where you tell me to march, I'll sign the petition you tell me to sign. Right,
100%,
okay, yeah, I get
exactly.
that.
And then at some point I was but wait, you're if you're this privileged, you're the person with the least knowledge of what we should be doing, the least lived experience of oppression. So all of those other people should be telling stories, and that's not what's happening. And if we did tell our stories, then we'd be following different goals and different dreams and different visions. And so we just need more of that. We just need more. It's not that person shouldn't tell stories, but it shouldn't be the only story, and it shouldn't be the dominant one that we're all building our house on. We should, center the most marginalized, because people are what's the point of someone who doesn't have an experience of oppression being this is how we fix this thing? It's what do you know, actually? Let's center the people who have those experiences and let's tell our stories and let's do that. So I think there's, even in that world, I saw it happening that I was, and I think that kind of system of power of stories and domination happens even in our scenes and our movements, where I was part of that power by just being sure, you know what you're doing, mate, I have no idea. You've got a PhD in Marxism, you must know something, and I don't, so what do I know? And I was part of that dynamic of giving away power, rather than being actually, what do you know about sex work? And I think there's something about that that's just another power dynamic to challenge in a way.
Yeah. Yeah.
That kind of had nothing to do with anything. But
What?
Was that connected?
No, I think it's very much connected, also because I'm thinking of the ways in which sorry, what? There's movement. I'm trying to be attentive to y'all, but because I will keep talking. Yeah, okay, nothing. So, so I think about the ways in which in your book there are certain ways I feel in the character of the park. There is a park in this book, in her book, and this park is really important. The park itself is a very important place, whether it is for very, very passionate illegal gay encounters, or for places where people can mobilize, when people can hide out against the state, and so on. So this park, it reminded me of the story that I read about enslaved people, like in the Caribbean, who were running away from the plantation, and who would find allyship with the marshes that they would run into, because the marshes had venomous snakes, extremely venomous snakes, and the snakes and the marshes would basically protect these runaway enslaved people, because the enslavers, the white people who would try to, they wouldn't be able to get through. They would be afraid of the snakes, and they wouldn't be able to find. And whole communities and villages were born in these of enslaved people who ran away, Maroons, and till today these people like still exist. Like this allyship with the marshes is what made them able to survive this. And I'm just sort of thinking, when you're describing these different stories and people at the margins rejecting the dominant sort of power relations, that it opens up possibilities for other kinds of alliances, like, for example, the resistance and the park, for example. And so I don't know, I guess my question is for you, or at least my admiration for you in your book, is for you to find so easily spaces and ways to tell these stories about allyships, to see that these allyships are possible.
Right. I never thought about it that way, but it's true, the park is a character or...
It's a character in and of itself.
Yeah, no, really true. Yeah, I do think about space a lot, but I hadn't kind of, great.
Yeah.
Park is a character. Yay, thanks.
And also, like, one of the things that I was a little bit, did make me sad in your stories is how, this notion of queer liberation, how easily it is co-opted.
I think the park becomes a nature reserve or something.
It becomes a nature reserve.
But in the worst possible way.
Yeah, and I thought maybe you could speak on that, on how do we make sure things don't end up, our communities don't end up co-opted by the greenwashing and the corporate greed and the corporate manipulation of our stories to fit whatever new, I don't know. Please tell me you have some sort of strategy or hope for how we can prevent that.
Pass the microphone.
Yeah. Or anybody here, maybe?
Yeah, I think that's something we need to crowdsource.
I can't be the only one who's concerned with how easily queer, specifically queer culture, is becoming so mainstream. When ASOS is doing commercials for gender fluid, non-binary aesthetics clothing and stuff, I'm like, something is happening here that I feel very, I'm worried about.
Yeah, I think that's something I feel like Conserve and Control, which is the second novel, although you can read them in any order, but it's the one that's set most in the future, takes Ash and Pinar, who are like two main characters from the first novel, and shows how they've been turned into statues, and they're there's a museum that used to be their little house, which is a place that we're very attached to in the first book, and this kind of corporatization, commercialization of their identities, and using it to support this new state, which is better than the old state, but it's still a state. And there's something, it's all just really, really cynical, which is why I love Conserve, even though it's the weirdest book. But I kind of, I just felt like there were warnings in a way, and but what is the solution? I don't know. Just don't do that. It's a tricky one. I think it's tricky particularly because it's co-optation of experiences and movements and people and individuals and communities that are marginal. So sometimes we just need to do whatever we need to do to survive. I think it's not easy to be like, oh no, we're selling out, this is a bad thing, because sometimes you just got to eat. And so I think that it's easier to do it if you're some evil co-opting person in a room with graphs, and I don't know what people do, but they're like trying to co-opt something. It's quite easy because people are desperate. And it's quite easy to divide and conquer. And it's quite easy to promise people something. And if you're a little bit more prone to selling out, then like, let's take you and let's build you a museum or something. And I think there's something in that it's quite hard to resist unless you're like building the resilience of those communities to resist that co-optation and theft.
Because specifically, I mean, it's not just queerness, but I think also ecological thinking that has become
100%.
co-opted, right? So I don't know if y'all know, but like a few years ago, we all massively, across Europe, voted for green parties all over Europe. We massively voted. In the Netherlands, Belgium, even the European Parliament, the Greens, the Groene, the GroenLinks, all these green parties have been doing really well in the electoral, the voters. So they become quite this notion of like we need to take care of the environment is becoming higher and higher place as a concern for the voters, right? And these parties are there to fill that gap. They're like, yes, we will do the environment. However, since the Ukrainian war, none of these parties necessarily are saying, oh, actually, we need to, this is the moment to stop with this gas consumption. Okay? They're making deals, like these governments and they're all making deals with, tyrants around the world to make sure we still have the gas. And, with Iran, like the city of Brussels is advertising how it's in solidarity with Iran, but the Belgian government is one of the many governments right now that are trying to get a gas deal with the Iranian government that is oppressing its people, right? So it's like, even that is also, it's not just queer culture that is being co-opted,
No,
it's just
absolutely.
all these, even ecological things being co-opted. So how do we...
I think, so to answer the first question, I think one way to resist it is like the same way to resist anything, it's building resilience. So the more we're meeting each other's material needs, the less desperate we are and the less willing we will be to sell out, for example. I don't know if it's that simple, that sounds very simple, but I'm trying to give you an answer.
Sometimes simple things are very complicated things.
Sure. Yeah, between what I just said and the reality, there's a big gap. But I do feel like that's where I would want to put my energy in. If it's just like, okay, co-optation, you can resist the co-optation, you can call it out, you can visibilize it, but like I want to stop it happening. And why is it happening? Because it's really possible and because we're desperate. And so like if we're like less desperate and we're meeting each other's needs, then maybe we don't need to sell out to a corporation. So I feel like there's something, again, this kind of like grassroots kind of constructive energy, just kind of like, well, let's just build our own thing and then we won't need that or something.
I think that's where I also think where it lies, where I see it's the building your own thing.
Right.
Do your own thing, however small, however, I don't know, how would you describe it? Like, however local, however specific, whether it's, I don't know, the gardens, the green spaces in your street, like to build projects that are super local and that are therefore also democratic because you're doing it with with the people in your neighborhood, with your friends, with your neighbors, and in that way, I think if we really make it, if we build our own things, we kind of make the things also resilient as well.
Agreed.
Not just us, but also the things that we engage in.
Yeah.
Because I think that we're kind of, the kind of culture we grew up in, we're geared toward, we're sort of primed for bigger and better, right? For this kind of bigger and better thinking. For the, let's get funding, let's get everyone to sign this petition, let's make it a bigger and better project because then we will be effective, right? Because there's this, we've kind of been rolled into this effective is scale. Economies of scale. So only if it becomes bigger will it be effective. And if we think of something and we think, oh, that's too small, that will never be big, oh, that's irrelevant, so let's not do it, right?
Which I think also creates like, impossible standards for people to, I mean, for myself, I've been in very, very large social movements, usually outside of Europe. And, you know, it's the collective effort of like millions of people. So, I don't know, when I'm in like activist crisis, which happens every other day, I realize that like it's all about like what should I be doing with my time on Earth or something. And I'm like, I don't know if that's the right question because it's not just all about me. And you know, I'm like, okay, I'll just like make a revolution by myself. That's what I should do. No one else is doing it. I'll do it. I'm like, it's a bit of an impossible expectation that I'm imposing on myself, like many people do. And actually, it's fine to do what you can do, and that's perfect. And sometimes, you know, like the byline here is survival as an act of resistance. And I do believe that. I think for a lot of people close to me, I'm just like, just get through the next year. That's all you need to be doing. You don't need to be having a crisis about it. I just want you to get through this.
Yep.
You don't need to be running anything, building something, being like this character on TV who runs all the things and does all the things. You could just survive. I'll be happy. That's all you need to do right now. Because if you're a person that society wants to kill and eradicate, by surviving, you're actually resisting. And I do believe that. And sometimes I even believe it for myself, which is obviously I have like double standards. I'm like, this is fine for everyone else that I love, but like I should be like really, really hard on myself. But sometimes I'm even just like, actually, right now, all I can do is just like get through.
Yeah.
And if the world kind of wants to eradicate people like me, then that's actually an act of resistance, and I'm going to do it really well, and I'm going to really survive.
Yeah.
Which is a hard thing to kind of own and admit because it feels really selfish or something. And I'm just like, that's fine sometimes. I mean, I'm totally fine for everyone else. I'm like super into it. But it can be hard to internalize those things for ourselves and just be like, no, I'm going to fucking survive. That's what I'm going to do. That's my act.
Sure.
There's something in there that feels really powerful to me.
True.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to your question when you said, how can we do it, you know? And it came to my mind as an example, the Palestinian story, because there is a big environmental part in that. I mean, Israeli settlers remove olive trees as old as 1,000 years, destroy land, steal water, and these people have been surviving for more than 70 years, actually preserving and maintaining and surviving their ecological system by creating very grassroots, very solidarity-based movements. They're there. They're just not European. I think we have many nice examples to look at, which brings me to a very important question I have about the ecological resistance. And I might be assuming, or I might not be so knowledgeable, but I will go ahead and ask it. Like, what fascinates me, what disturbs me in these big climate or environmental movements we've seen, is that war is absent from the story. And the Greens in Belgium, they came into power and they voted, including during confinement, to bomb. They voted in parliament to send planes to bomb. At the time it was Iraq, but they constantly bomb. They're constantly, and we're talking green parties voting in parliament, and the military industry is one of the biggest polluters today.
Absolutely.
My country, Lebanon, in the south, the soil is filled with phosphorus that has been dropped on purpose to destroy ecology. And that's never brought to the forefront. And I imagine many other examples also.
I'm going to give you this one. Speak on it.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that story. I think the other thing that I wanted to say earlier as well, and this really was a good reminder, is that if we're thinking about solutions, or like even individual solutions, I think part of it is like, whatever story you're being told is probably a really simple version of something that's way more complex and way more real. And for example, like commercial Green Party will be selling you one story and will not be mentioning that because why would they mention that if they're like, obviously it's a contradiction and so people wouldn't vote for them or something. So I think it's always like, when we can, just being kind of skeptical about it and just being like, this is probably a more complicated story here. There's probably loads more layers. There's loads more perspectives. I'm sure there's loads of things that I'm not being told. Let's dig deeper. And we can, if we have that mindset when we're approaching new things, we can kind of always be digging deeper, I think. There's always more. It's always more complex. And I think I have this, and I think many people have it. Sometimes there's, well, actually I don't have it so much, but I think many people have like an innate desire to make things really simple because it's easier, and they want to believe that they're good or something, and they're quite attached to that, and they're like, they want to believe a story is really easy because they want it to be easy so that they can participate in it. That like, these are the good guys, these are the bad guys, everything is Hollywood. I'm one of the good guys because that's what I want to believe about myself, and everything is simple. And oh my God, that's obviously can never be true. It's always more complex. And I actually don't know how to get people who have this kind of desire to like simplify everything to kind of approach every new thing with like, okay, but what am I missing? What are the other perspectives? Because I think if you do that, you kind of always assume that there's going to be like really complex, and then you can kind of hold all of that complexity and deal with things in a more real way than just like throw some money at a major conservation organization because they told you a really nice story about pandas.
Or
and
vote for a Green Party.
Right? And if you're always just kind of like, interesting. What else? What other stories am I missing here? Then you probably wouldn't do that, and you would look deeper into it, and then you would make your own decisions based on more data. But if you're always just like, this is the story, it's super simple, and I totally get why people want that, but I never do. I'm always just kind of like, oh, that's a nice story. Let's hear the other 99% that I'm missing. Always come to it with complexity in mind or something.
I noticed something in your book as well. Like, this is sci-fi, speculative fiction, with only one real mention of new technology. And this one new technology of the future, you really don't seem to trust it. And I thought that was interesting. The focus of your speculative fiction, other than like what I'm used to, was not all these new technological things. It wasn't Black Mirror, you know? It wasn't like, ooh, we have found ways to do this. What does that mean, you know? It was very much about relationships, about the state, and about, you know, sort of, again, great stuff. But you seem very suspicious. Well, I think that that's one of our new, simpler stories about the technology will save us. The green technology will save us.
Right.
How come you're so suspicious of the green technology? Don't you believe in...
So many layers to this question. No, obviously not. You know, I remember reading something, no idea what I read, but there was something talking about like solar panels, and they're like, solar panels, it's great because this, this, and this, obviously, all the things that we know. Also, what are they made out of, and where did that come from? And I think it's in Conserve, there's some kind of mystery new mineral that like everything's being made out of. It's really, really useful. And the story is being told very simply in one place, and in the other place it's like, this is where it's extracted, this is where the exploitation is happening, this is the reality of where this magical mineral comes from that everything is built out of. And pretty sure that's how the world works. And yeah, I just feel like that's not... Things that are being built out of things being mined out of the world, out of the ground, probably isn't ever going to be sustainable. I think that's just like an inherently unsustainable thing. And there's many other options, and I kind of feel like that's a really convenient option, and people make a lot of money out of it. And any time that like corporations and governments are like, this is the thing, I'm like, it's probably not the thing.
It's probably not the thing. It's probably not the thing. And I thought that was also really interesting because I think, I don't know if I'm projecting, but I think what you're, in your book, you seem to be very positive towards the notion of a future of people kind of going back to a certain past, to a certain level of relationships, so small, localized, people like living outside of the city, kind of being self-sufficient, you know, walking to go find each other and visit each other. Yeah. Like there's this sort of, and anti-technology, like a sort of like anti-modernity thing going on, would I dare say that you might be of the opinion
Suspense.
that we need maybe to, turn back?
I think there's a question of like who's we and what is turning back, which is a terrible way to answer a question. I'm sorry for like just being like, what? Define your terms. But I do think
I love this.
but I do think that's important. I think I'm not really presenting solutions very often. That's kind of my thing, is just being like, somebody asked me in an interview once, so they're like, okay, so your like first main characters are like living outside of the city now and they're having a great time and that's really nice and they have like, I don't know, their herbal apothecary and everything is nice. And I was like, yeah, they were also evicted like violently from the city, so that's a complicated story. And there's all these social movements and it's quite utopian because I just needed something nice, but also everyone's a bit of a hot mess. And it's a bit messy, and everyone's a bit fucked up, and everyone's like, no one's getting anything right, really. Like, people are like trying very hard and doing the thing, but also like everyone's a mess because we're actually a mess. So I think, as far as I know, I'm not very often being like, this is the thing we should do, because, anti-technology, like, is throwing my disabled friends under the bus. And anti-civilization is doing the same thing. And I feel like a lot of these like big solutions kind of throw away a lot of the people that I love, including myself in many ways. I'm like probably not gonna think that that's the great solution. So I think it's complex. And I think like what I've often found myself in a position where I'm like, okay, so I need to like work out what, so I can like, call out all these things and I can see these very big like, systems of oppression or something, so I should also be presenting like this counter argument of like a very big structure of what it should be, and it should be this ism or this ism or something. I'm like, I don't have that knowledge. What I can do, and I'm just not that like intellectual, I think, as well. I just don't know, and I haven't read those books or something. But what I can do is like this thing right now with these people and build that thing, and that feels more accessible to me than ever like forcing myself to create like a really big picture, because I just can't. I think it's more complex, and why would I be the person to do that as well? But I am the person to be like, this is the solution to the thing that I'm experiencing. No one else speak on my behalf. I have an idea, and let's try this thing that I can experience and see the results of and like perceive change. And that's the level I can work on, I think. Yeah. So it's often just like, I just need like some tangible something. Yes?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, that was it. The end.
You were very much going like, and you're like, are you finished? Oh, there are questions on the chat. Oh, hold on.
There's a chat.
There's a chat. There's a live stream going on. Hold on. I'm very bad at it. I knew me being with you was not a good idea.
It's a great idea. Please. We heard you, I think.
Okay, sorry.
We heard you.
So-
Did everybody? Yeah. No? Yes? Okay.
So
Loud and
that
clear.
about, just showing my respect for the plants. Then my question is, we could actually completely regenerate this planet or help the planet regenerate, like as in we being servants to the species that can, like the plants and the trees who can actually do it. But we need to get the chance. And this is really the problem. Like we could plant a city full of fruit trees so that people don't have to go to expensive bio shops and we can just pick apples and our children can see that, but we're not allowed to. And the land is mostly in the hands of the rich. If you look at Belgium, we have these huge monocultures which we could turn into fertile food forests. It's in a couple of years we could feed ourselves, but we're not allowed to. How the fuck do we get the land back? This is like what keeps me like.
How do we get the land back? Yeah. How do we get the land back? Yeah. Yeah. Anybody in the room?
Thank you for sharing.
Do you know how to get?
How do we get the land back? No, can't answer that. But yes, I feel it. Feel it. 100%.
Yeah.
And it's true that it's not so simple as like, this is what we should do. It's like, that's probably going to involve a load of violence. And I think it's people with a lot of privilege will just be like, here's a solution, do this thing. And either it's not a solution, like on a deep kind of radical level, or that's a person who can deal with that kind of violence and like doesn't have anything to lose or something. But people in general will be like, we need to do this thing, it's going to fuck us up. And so that obviously that's how power maintains itself, because you're too much at risk to do the other thing. And that's a very real complexity. Or you're too busy because you're working 70 hours a week and who has time to do a thing. Or you're a person who's like not going to survive in prison. Or, there's just like so much stopping us do the thing. And so of course we want to buy a really easy, nice story, because then you feel like you did the thing, but you didn't have to take any risks. Great, I want that too, that sounds nice. I just don't believe it, and unfortunately I'm too skeptical. But yeah, if you want to take the land, it's going to be a problem. There's going to be a mess. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it, but it means that certain people might have to take certain roles in that. Certain people will have to show up for other people. And yeah, think about risk and think about danger, because that's a very real and present thing if you're really challenging something radically, like taking someone's land and growing food on it that we need.
It's 21:34.
Ooh.
And I really hate going over time because, again, I try to make a commitment to the other people who make this possible for us. My takeaway for tonight is complexity. Is at the very end, risks. We cannot do this without taking any risks. So we must make strategic choices and thoughtful choices when it comes down to the risks. My other takeaway is perspectives, right? Which is tied into this complexity thing, this perspective.
And stories
and
perspectives. Yeah, it's really a different word for the same thing.
I really connected to that. I also kind of want to, from the books, one other takeaway I had in general is solidarity. Solidarity with those directly in your lives, in your city, on your continent, on this globe. But solidarity not just with people you like. That was also something I thought was interesting in the book. It wasn't just people that liked each other that were in solidarity with each other. It was also people you may not like, may not understand. Also non-humans that you may not understand. And alliances. That's my takeaway from this lecture tonight and these great books that you have written that I hope people get and read them. I'm very grateful for tonight. Thank you so much, Kes, for coming. And I hope to see you again soon, other places, other moments. And I want to thank you all for being here tonight and for being patient. I want to wish you a very good evening, safe home traveling and everything, and stay caring and kind to one another. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are you okay? Good job, good job. Okay, now get out of here. Oh.